to all of our viewers on the Forum on Women, Religion, Violence, and Power. You are visiting our Thursday lunchtime virtual roundtables that we have begun at the Carter Center to amplify the voices of human rights defenders and those who are really leading on the advancement of the rights of women and girls and the end to violence. So we are extremely excited today to have two distinguished figures in the work of ending sexual exploitation. And we have with us today two guests who are going to be joining us next week for our World Summit on ending sexual exploitation at the Carter Center, May 11th and 12th. There will be a live webcast at 2 p.m. Eastern Time on May 12th, where former President Jimmy Carter will be joining us to discuss this important topic. So we're really glad to kick off the whole week on this very, very urgent topic with two guests. Norma Ramos is a long-standing social justice attorney, and she's joining us today. And Farley, Doctor, is a feminist research psychologist who has, because of her work on ending sexual exploitation, has become what she calls an abolitionist in the movement to end sexual exploitation. Welcome, Melissa and Norma, to you both. I want to start with a quote that Melissa sent me that I love, and it says, a Chilean psychiatrist once said that prostitution is to society what incest is to the family. How do you understand that, both of you, and what does it really mean? And Melissa, let's start with you. What is the problem with prostitution? What are the harms? Many experts say that there are overlaps between domestic violence and prostitution, like negative dynamics of power and control over another human being, and traumatic bonding with a perpetrator, like with a pimp or trafficker. Is the psychological harm of prostitution different from domestic violence or rape? Can you talk to us about that?
Well, as the Chilean psychiatrist said, who was also a social justice activist, of course, because he saw that connection between prostitution and the well-being of the culture and incest and the well-being of the family. The harms of prostitution are on a continuum of sexual violence, with prostitution and trafficking at an extreme end of violence. And then on the continuum, we have all the other forms of violence against women: incest, battering, rape, sexual harassment, and sex discrimination. What I would say the similarities between incest in the family and prostitution in the culture is that it's a covered-up secret. Mm-hmm. Nobody talks about it clearly. Nobody says, this is a problem and we have to do something about it, which is one of the reasons I am so happy to be here, happy to be invited to this summit by former President Jimmy Carter and your team, because as I understand it, the point of all this is to position prostitution as an institution within the panoply of human rights and social justice wrongs that we're dealing with and trying to eradicate in the world. So I guess that's what I'd start out by saying.
Well, that's so important, because often there are distinctions that we make between prostitution and other forms of sexual violence and other forms of sexual exploitation. And so we're going to get into that. Norma, in the 1980s, you coined the phrase, prostitution is the world's oldest oppression. We hear this phrase that prostitution is the world's oldest profession, and you've turned that around. So talk about that, and how do you think liberals and leftists view prostitution in a way that's problematic, and what do we do about it?
Well, this actually goes right along with what Dr. Farley has just been talking about. Prostitution has somehow been separated from the gender-based continuum of violence against women. And I think it's because we get on that very curious ground of privilege. And prostitution has done what? Prostitution is an institution that has made available to those with privilege, male privilege particularly, to buy the bodies of women and children for sexual use and abuse. So we've turned human beings in prostitution into commodities that can be bought and sold for sexual use and abuse. And I think therein lies the problem that we see with liberals on the left that refuse to understand prostitution as, number one, gender-based violence. As Dr. Farley just talked about, it is on a continuum of violence against women. But we have the advent of, most disturbing, liberal women who call themselves feminist, who then go on to say, oh, well, with prostitution, we are seeing work and we are seeing choice, when in fact, anyone who spends more than 5 minutes talking to survivors of prostitution will clearly describe to you a lack of choice, a function of incredible lack of choices that have been constrained to the point of we're talking about extreme oppression. And we have that then rationalized by individuals who say they're in the business of ending inequality, who say they're in the business of advancing women's rights, carving out this curious exception that allows women and girls to remain in a subclass that are being used and abused in ways that we talk about torture.
Right. That's right. And as we've been organizing this summit, it's been quite surprising to me about this this sort of dispute among feminists and among people who support human rights. I understand on the one hand, because when you are a person in a circumstance, you deserve human rights. So if you find yourself doing what is called sex work, we call exploitation, etc., there are human rights that accrue to you, that you obviously there are rights that belong to you. And so the question, those people need to be supported. People who are being exploited need to be supported. So the question is, how do we do that as a society? And this is why some of these root questions are important now, because we don't want to forever legitimize such a horrific fact that or reality for so many people. So Melissa, I'd like to ask you, what do you think is the root problem? We want to get to the root, so there are so many ways to go about this, but how do we do that? You've said the prostitution institution is an institution that's rooted in sexism, racism, and poverty. Can you explain that? And also, you know, President Carter has been talking about this lately in his book, A Call to Action, Women, Religion, Violence, and Power, where he supports the Swedish approach to ending sexual exploitation quite explicitly. And we can talk about the Swedish approach. We also call it the Swedish model. But you know, but then we find ourselves in a situation where the United Nations is and human rights organizations, even like Amnesty International, are beginning to call for the legalization of prostitution, which is different from the Swedish model because, of course, you don't want to criminalize victims and survivors, but to legalize the buyer and the profiteer, the pimp and the John, that is
okay. Let me start
as a proposal.
This is a whole series of questions, and they're wonderful. But let me go back to that first one that you asked, Karen, which was about the roots of the problem. And then I also would like to follow up with something Ms. Ramos said about carving out groups of human beings so that it appears as if we're doing something about the problem, but we're not really striking at the heart of the institution. I think the roots of the problem are simple and very, very deep, and often can be overwhelming to people. There are 3 bars on the cage that keeps women, children, transgendered people in prostitution, and those 3 bars are sexism, racism, and poverty. Sometimes people feel that they can't address all 3 of them, and that's a problem because you can't really understand prostitution unless you get right down on the ground in the real world and see that who is in prostitution is overwhelmingly the young, females, and overwhelmingly people who are marginalized because of ethnicity or race. That's who's in it. And so that tells us something about the roots of the institution. It is the people who are running the sex industry, who are profiting from it, and most of all the buyers are, we have to acknowledge this. These are not just nice guys who need to get laid. These are predators who are seeking out the most vulnerable human beings in our culture, who in this case happen to be young women of color for the most part. So that's the issue. Then what you see happening is a compartmentalization of these issues. I think sometimes because people are well-intentioned but overwhelmed, sometimes because they think it's strategic for fundraising purposes. I'm not sure why, but people carve out different groups of trafficked or prostituted people, like children, or like indoor versus outdoor prostitution, or, for example, you know, any other subgroup in this huge group of people who are trafficked and prostituted. And once we start dividing them off, let's just take the example of children. Once we focus our activism, our advocacy, and our laws on minors, what are we saying to the Johns and the pimps? We're saying, all right, you can't have the kids, but the minute she blows that birthday candle out on her 18th birthday, you can have her. I think that's a devastating message, and I think we have to include all people inside that institution who are under third-party control, that is to say, pimped or trafficked, which is almost everybody. I don't know, Norma, do you have other things to say about that compartmentalization?
Oh, yes, I do, because I think this is, you know, I have a lot of concerns about the direction of the anti-trafficking movement because I see a lot of compromising now. You know, like any social justice movement that begins to have success, Melissa, you and I have been working against commercial sexual exploitation for a very long time, and this movement now is growing and money is showing up. And so what I begin to see is a dilution of the messaging. What I begin to see is compromising. And the number one compromise I see is the separation of adult prostitution from child prostitution. What people need to understand about that is that you have to start with ending adult prostitution. And why is that? Because it is adults who keep children safe. And if adults can be sold to be used and abused in commercial sexual exploitation, which is what we call prostitution, then a child surely will be. So if we cannot be principled and take a strong principled stand and say that it is not okay for any human being to be bought and sold for commercial sexual use and abuse in order to put a roof over their head, in order to put food on their table, if we will not say that it is not okay to do that to anyone, then we have compromised our movement and goals coming right out of the gate. And I see that happening. As soon as I see an organization's mission is solely addressing child trafficking, then I know that they are unwilling to take on the difficult discussion, which is what happens to those former children the adults. Those are just former children in prostitution. Do we no longer bring compassion to the 25-year-old that we brought to the 15-year-old? And the part of the movement that I'm a part of calls itself abolitionist because we say this is a problem of social justice. This is the world's oldest oppression, and we are going to fight for a world where no human being, and I am going to use a phrase that survivors taught me, where no human being has to give a blowjob to eat a sandwich. This is what a survivor taught me.
Wow. So is it true, I've heard this statistic, that something like 80% of those in prostitution started as minors? Is that a correct statistic?
I'm not sure. It varies. I don't think I'm not sure about that, Karen. It varies based on the economics in the country you're talking about. Here in the U.S., we're now seeing women exchanging sex acts for a tank of gas or a cheeseburger. That tells us something about the recession. It tells us something about the lack of safety nets. And activists in our movement, it would be fabulous if they could, some groups of us could focus our attention on housing, housing, housing. Because in 9 countries on 5 continents, housing is the most urgent issue, keeping women stable, long-term housing, keeping people out of prostitution.
This is a very...
Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to say you just hit right at it, because this is the thing that when I talk about this issue, when we talk about choice, and that there are human beings that choose this, okay, so maybe there might be a teeny tiny percentage of women that might choose this. And what I say about that is those who choose to get into this can choose to get out. But the vast majority of human beings found in prostitution, of women and children found in prostitution, are there because of lack of choice. And we are talking about growing up in foster care, where you graduate from foster care, which I feel is a form of homelessness because children in foster care already feel homeless, and you graduate into homelessness, and there's a huge connection, as was just mentioned by Dr. Farley, between homelessness and prostitution. And there's a huge and we have to ask ourselves, and going back to the question of liberals, why are women of color overrepresented in prostitution? Why are those who have been in the foster care system, which are among our most vulnerable children, why are they overrepresented in foster care? Why are indigenous women overrepresented in foster care? And when you look at who makes up the world's prostituted, we are looking at the most vulnerable of women and girls. And let's also point to the fact that many of these women and girls have already experienced sexual abuse in their homes. So they've never known what it is to be safe. They've had their sexuality already used and abused. And so I think that with this issue, what we want to see is an anti-trafficking movement that no longer delinks prostitution from sex trafficking, since, by the way, prostitution is the end point of sex trafficking. So when we talk about working against human trafficking and sex trafficking, we must start from a very principled position that we take on ending prostitution.
That's right. And so back to, I would like to come back to this question of the part of, or a segment of probably very well-meaning people who are promoting legalization. And as we see this trend in the United Nations, we see this in countries like New Zealand, Germany, etc., legalization of prostitution. And you know, some of the arguments I've heard is that, you know, you have to bring it out from underground in order to mitigate harm, etc., very much along the lines of the legalization of marijuana arguments. So let's talk about that a minute, because I was very surprised to learn about this and quite horrified, actually. So I'm personally new to this division that has emerged, and can you talk to our audience about that? I'm not trying to fan the flames of division here. I just want to understand, how can we break through that and help people to understand that by legalization actually means that more people will end up in exploitation. More people will be exploited. It's not the harm mitigation argument seems very shallow to me. So can we talk about that a little bit, Melissa? Melissa, let's start with you and then go on to Norma.
Sure. Well, let's fan the flame of the vision. That's okay. That's okay. And let me be very clear about this. Legalization or decriminalization, which is a variant of legalization, legalization is directly blocking all of our vision of a world without sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, and prostitution. It is in the way. Legalization says for some people, the job, especially poor women of color, for those people, the job of prostitution is okay. I disagree with that so strongly that I can't even express it right here. If it's not good enough for us, it's not good enough for them. If it's not good enough for my daughter, it's not good enough for someone else's daughter. She deserves the same thing that we and our children want, which is a life of safety without rape that involves a good education and a meaningful job and safety for our kids. So legalization gets in the way of all of our and former President Carter's vision for women. So what do we know about legalization? Mostly people are listening to the myths and, frankly, lies of the sex industry on this issue. A remarkable study came out a couple years ago from the London School of Economics. In 150 countries, wherever prostitution was legalized, trafficking increased. Now, why is that? Because legalization lays out a legal welcome mat for traffickers. It says traffickers are pimps. Sometimes I think that's a fancy word for a thug and a pimp. Let's call them what they are. Traffickers are pimps. It says to the pimps, come on over. You can set up shop here in my country or in my state, in the case of Nevada. So legalization does not decrease the harms. There's a great deal of evidence that prostitution is harmful to the people in it, regardless of its legal status, regardless of whether it's high class or low class, regardless of whether it's inside or outside. We're seeing overwhelming emotional distress. We studied this in 9 countries and 5 continents. Regardless of whether it's legal or illegal, it still causes this profound harm called post-traumatic stress disorder at the same level of veterans of combat, battered women seeking shelter, survivors of state-sponsored torture, or rape survivors seeking treatment. It's an extremely emotionally distressful activity. I don't know. I hope it's okay to say this. It's so hard. I mean, I really appreciated Norma quoting the words of a survivor. It's really hard to talk about prostitution in the abstract. When you're doing 10 blowjobs for strangers who smell bad and who get you all messed up on your face and all other parts of your body, it's really hard to have any shred of dignity and to avoid grotesque humiliation, which is what people feel in prostitution. And when you experience that day after day, year after year, with a bunch of people running around saying, well, let me give you a condom and a cup of coffee and go back out there, and here's how to earn another $1 for another blowjob or anal sex. It doesn't work. So there's no evidence that it protects women from harm. In fact, there's quite a bit of evidence that in legal brothels, for example, in Nevada or Germany, the legal pimps who run the brothel are there to earn money. and they don't turn away highly intoxicated Johns. They encourage them. Mm-hmm. That is the most dangerous kind of prostitution, with men who are very drunk. Women get hurt the worst when they're drunk. Even on the street, a woman can notice whether a John is intoxicated and tell him, keep going, I don't want to see you. You can't do that in legal prostitution. It's bad for business. That's just a couple examples. And Norma, maybe you have more to, or Karen.
Yes. I'd like to hear from Norma, and I also just would like to just know why, if I want to hear from Norma, and then afterwards both of you, and to address why do you think the United Nations and organizations like Amnesty are promoting legalization? Norma, over to you.
Well, you know, this is what I started talking about, and we need to go a little further with this, because one of the keys to understanding the answer to that question is that we talked about a continuum of violence against women, with prostitution on one of the extreme ends, on the extreme end with sex trafficking, and which are in many instances the same. Not all instances, but in most instances. And what we have to understand is that this is the only form of violence against women where there is an entire industry that supports it. Remember, we don't have an economic base to domestic violence. We don't have an economic base in the general sense of understanding an economic base to incest, to sexual abuse of children. But with prostitution, we have an economic base. Now, when you have an economic base as formidable, we don't just have an economic base. We have a formidable economic base. You're going to have its defenders. Some of them well-intentioned, some of them uninformed, some of them well-meaning. Some of the people that think, well, you help prostituted women by calling them sex workers. Well, what we say to that is, no, you don't help prostituted women by calling them sex workers. You help them by helping them get out. So we have to understand that there is an enormous industry that is organized and controlled largely by organized crime that has a huge investment in seeing this form of violence against women continuing. Now, there's another thing to understand about your question, Karen, about the UN and institutions like Amnesty International. Our position that you hear Melissa Farley and I articulate, that is supported by all the major conventions at the UN. CEDAW, for instance, has language that talks about working against the prostitution of others. And so our analysis is actually rooted in human rights theory and human rights law. So the reason we are dealing with opposition is not because we are articulating something other than a human rights analysis, is that we are talking about the profit motive. We are talking about an economic industry devoted to the buying and selling of human beings for sexual use and abuse.
I think it's such an important question, Karen, because people new to this field are a little intimidated by the extreme aggression of the sex worker advocacy crowd, some of which is in Amnesty. I do want to say there are a lot of people who have left Amnesty because of the bankruptcy of this position on prostitution and trafficking, and there are people who are working inside Amnesty, which has been in the distant past an outstanding human rights organization. There are people working inside Amnesty to shift this position. But they have basically, for example, gotten their working papers from pimps. People don't know that. But it's a dilemma of a lot of the left, that they are listening to what is in effect propaganda without empirical evidence from people who are representing the sex industry. And by the way, the pimps are not all stereotypical men. Many are women. And they're online, and they are, I think, to help people understand it, they make it look hip and liberal and sexual libertarianism. to support prostitution. They try and put it in the same category as supporting lesbians and gays and transgendered people. It is not in the same category. It is not at all. It's an institutional form of harm. So we just have to keep letting groups like Amnesty, they're not the only one out there. There are groups that have names like the Global Alliance Against Sex Trafficking. Sounds good, doesn't it? Sounds good, but it's Human Rights Watch. These are groups that sound good. I would urge everyone at the Carter Center, everyone who cares about the equality of women, when you consider joining a group, look at what they're saying, not so much about trafficking, but about prostitution. Do they understand that prostitution is an institution that cements the sex, race, and economic inequality of women and some men?
Yes, and this is very much the position that President Carter took in his book. It's very much what he's been talking about, and in fact, it's very much why we're hosting this summit, because when he did an interview with Robin Morgan last year during his book tour, and she told him about Amnesty's position, he just reacted very strongly during the interview and said, well, why would you legalize the slave owner, in those words. And she said, wow, let's talk more about this. And so we began to really reach out and understand these complexities. And so the summit that we're hosting, we're going to do our best, because we have all of these communities meeting together. Those who are focusing on child sex trafficking, and for very practical reasons, Norma, as you've cited. So our objective at the Carter Center is to really elevate this discussion to a human rights discussion, so that we can move forward. So that's our commitment, the Carter Center for sure. And I think it begins with understanding, because I know that there are a lot of very well-meaning people who believe that this policy is really in the interest of people. And I think once we're going to persuade a lot of people when they see that this is a dead end in terms of harm mitigation, that we're going to really build the movement. I believe that's what I hope. And I want
I'm so glad to hear you bring up slavery, Karen.
Sorry. Go ahead, Melissa.
I just would like to say a couple things about slavery. For a long time, I shied away from talking about that, but I've come to see that prostitution is always either frank slavery or a slavery-like practice. And we abolitionists are going through a lot of the same things that the abolitionists went through when we were trying to stop slavery in the U.S. a century ago. Where do you think we'd be today if those abolitionists went onto the plantations and said, are you over 18 or are you under 18? I'm going to give you a little screening question, asking slaves on a plantation, were you forced or were you not forced? What do you think that slave is going to say? We have to step back and look at the whole institution and understand that we have to get rid of the institution of prostitution, which is where trafficking happens, and not just try and fix it.
Yes, and this is where people look at you sideways and they say, you want to end prostitution? Well, good luck with that. I mean, you face a definite cynicism about it, and I think what our objective really is going to be with this summit is to really encourage people that there are interventions that work, and this is why I think the Swedish model, maybe we can talk about that for a minute, Melissa, is to talk about the Swedish approach that is working so well there compared to other places, other countries where they have legalized prostitution. And then I do want to save some time to talk about the role of pornography in this question. I've learned a lot about that in the last year, and I think it's very important for people to understand because it's so normalized, and it's such a pathway into sexual. It's such an invidious form of sexual exploitation that I think we need to address it here. But first, let's go ahead and really address that first question, Melissa, for you.
You mean what is the Swedish law?
Yes.
I mean, Norma has been working internationally for the last decade advocating the application of the Swedish law. I mean, Norma, why don't you explain that? I'll jump in behind you.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, it's a great passion in my life. The Nordic model is what we call it now because other countries have passed it. But here's the heart of what we owe the wonderful Swedish feminists who gave the world's first, most inspired, human rights-based, women's rights-based legal framework with which to address prostitution. And long story short, what happened is that upon the collapse of the Soviet Union, Sweden was overrun with sex trafficking. And there had been human rights heroes who had been working against prostitution already in that country, people like Gunilla Ekberg and many others who came to understand that the real problem here was violence against women. And Sweden, of course, the Nordic countries lead the world in all indicators of achieving gender inequality. And so these human rights activists that were fighting for women's equality began to understand that, you know what, we've been arresting the wrong people. We have been arresting the victims. And so how do we go about creating a society that achieves equality for women and addresses this particular form of violence against women? And they came up with the model that is now known as the Nordic model, which is you arrest the traffickers and the buyers, the Johns, but you give those who are bought and sold, the prostituted women and girls. Notice I never call anyone a prostitute because I believe they are not that which has been done to them. Mm-hmm. So you give the prostituted women and girls an exit strategy. So they came up with this world model of how you do, in fact, end the world's oldest oppression by arresting the buyers and the traffickers and giving women an exit strategy. And that, of course, starts with housing. That starts with job training, educational opportunities, and yes, some psychological support because of the damage we know that is done through prepaid rape. And now, of course, other countries have followed suit. Norway has passed the Swedish model. The most recent country to pass it was Ireland, both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think it seems to me that what I've learned is that there are sort of the three pillars of this, well, four pillars of this approach. One is decriminalizing the prostituted person. So don't arrest the prostituted person. Instead, provide exit and care services for that person. Okay, so that's the second pillar, exit and care services. No arrest, exit and care services. The other two seem to be severe and adequate prosecution of the buyer and the pimp, or the traffickers, profiteers. And the fourth one seems to be robust public education, is from what I understand, is informing the public about the harms, so that people begin to get it, like almost like the anti-tobacco campaigns, where you had to really educate the public in order for people to eventually understand the harms and make other choices. Am I right about those four pillars and that they're essential to go together?
Absolutely. The most important thing is the cultural shift. But go ahead, Melissa.
I mean, I'm glad to hear you bring up the issue. I agree with both of you that education is crucial, although right now in the United States we're seeing a historic shift in how law enforcement approaches even our existing laws on the books in most states, which are frankly inadequate and inappropriate to the severity of the crime we're talking about against humanity. I mean, prostitution should not be a misdemeanor. It should be felonized in all states. That's essentially the level of crime it is in Sweden. That says to the culture, we take this seriously. Now, to the line, oh, you're never going to end prostitution, I would say, we have laws against murder, don't we? Even though we know there are always going to be people committing murder, we need to make the statement as a society, this is a practice we oppose. So we're not naive. We don't think prostitution is going to end in 6 months, but we think making a firm statement against it via laws is important. Can I talk a little bit, you all, is this okay if I talk about what we've learned in the last 6 or 7 years about sex buyers as part of the whole educational picture? Melinda, would you throw that slide up of the young woman standing surrounded by 21 Johns in Mexico City? Would you mind doing that? Yay, thank you. So this is the attitude that sex buyers have. When I asked one man that we interviewed, how would you explain prostitution to someone who doesn't understand it, he said, well, it's renting an organ for 10 minutes. This is why, in a nutshell, we view prostitution as a crime of violence against women on a continuum of human rights in our society. After like 15 years of studying prostitution and documenting the harms to the person in it, a group of us thought it's time to study the buyer. We don't know enough about the perpetrator. We don't know about his thinking, his attitudes. So, did you want to say something, or? Oh,
no.
Okay.
No.
We don't know enough about that. So now that we've studied prostitution in a number of countries, and by the way, we're not the only ones. I was ecstatic to hear of this study of 1,000 men each in Chile, Croatia, Rwanda, India, and Mexico. That's 5,000 men. In all of these countries, whenever a man had a history of having bought sex, he was more likely to rape. And this is the same connection we're finding in our research, that attitudes supportive of violence against women, tolerance of rape, tolerance of prostitution, acceptance of prostitution are all connected with overall sexual aggression. Not just sexual aggression against women in prostitution, but aggression against all women and girls in the culture. And we're finding some interesting things out about these guys. We've done 2-hour interviews of almost 700 men who buy sex in 5 countries, and we're finding out that men who buy sex, where we compared them to men who don't buy sex, the men who buy sex have less empathy in general. They tend to be supportive of rape myths. You know, those attitudes that say, well, she says no, but she means yes. Or if a woman looks sexy to someone, that means she's quote unquote asking for it. We found that sex buyers were more accepting of their children going into prostitution and working in places like strip clubs. Could you throw that cartoon up now? That where does the sex trafficking cartoon? Because what we know is that when you're accepting of all other arms of the sex industry, then like strip clubs and pornography, these are not separate from prostitution and trafficking. These are a part of an entire industry with a lot of different arms, just the way the tobacco industry sells cigarettes, sells those vapor pipes, sells all kinds of different brands of cigarettes and like that. So
yes,
I guess I'll quit here.
So that's perfect, and I want to I want to ask Norma one question about men, and then I want to continue along what you just started, Melissa, about pornography, because I think that's a really, really important area to understand when we're trying to think about how to end sexual exploitation. But Norma, can you first talk to us about your thoughts about how to involve men in ending sexual exploitation? How do we engage them? How important is it? And what are you doing? What is your work in this area?
You know, when I began to do this work, this advocacy around ending commercial sexual exploitation, I really had to ask myself, what did I think? Where is this problem coming? Why are men? You know, we've become a species where the male half is destroying the female half through sex, through sexual violence, and I had to ask myself, how did we get to that point? And I looked around my life, and there are many men in my life that I love who would never do this to women. So how did we get to a point where so many are doing this to women and girls and children? And I concluded that rapists and johns and batterers and those who would sexually harass women and girls and who would abuse children, these men are made. They're not born. Mm-hmm. So what has happened? Well, we know that there are many factors. We know that there's not just one factor, but in those cofactors, you'd have to look at the issue of pornography. And what I have come to understand is that pornography, and the phrase I've come up with is, pornography is corrupting male sexuality. So the first thing men have to do is to take their sexuality back from the pornographers. And I think that could be achieved just the same way that the women's movement began, which was through series of small meetings of conscious-raising groups. And I think there needs to be a men's movement, whether they're small groups or large groups, where men began to have honest conversations among themselves about the role of pornography in their lives, how it has shaped their lives. One of the things I would say would be to start reading. You could start with 2 books, though there are many that could be read, including the first book that I read, Female Sexual Slavery by Kathy Barry. When I began to grapple with this issue and wanted to understand better, even in my heart I knew that prostitution was violence against women, she gave us a real political framework with which to understand it. But I think they need to start with Dr. Gail Dine's book, Pornland, How the Pornography Industry Has Hijacked Our Sexuality. Men need to read that in groups and begin to do some self-reflection on what has happened. Derek Jensen, by the way, gave a conference and I just did a radio show with him where he talked about that. And so they have to take their sexuality back from the pornographers, and then they have to become very conscious of what the prostitution industry is. Who are the women and girls in it for them to buy, and what is done to them? And I would say, bar none, the book by Rachel Moran, Paid For, is the most compelling and accurate description of the harm that is done when women and girls are bought in prostitution. And so there's self-education that needs to go on, but it's never enough to educate yourself. You need to act politically. And what has happened is that nowhere in the world has there ever been a sustained movement of men who have made it their political priority to end violence against women. And so that is the role of men. We need men to make it their political priority to achieve women's equality. And the way you achieve women's equality on all fronts, pay equity, is that you have to end violence against women. You have to end all the ways in which women and girls are devalued. And of course, once that happens, once that men make it their political priority to end all forms of violence against women and work with women and be accountable to women to achieve women's equality, we will be living in an entirely different world. We will really then stand a chance to ending war. We will really then stand a chance to ending racism and the environmental destruction. And so what I'm saying is at the root of this is that on the planet there is a huge energy imbalance, and that energy imbalance is between men and women. And so we need all hands on deck with male leadership working first to end all forms of violence against women and start with the worst abuse. prostitution?
You know, thank you. That was inspiring.
It was.
I want to just get back to a couple things about pornography, because people are so confused about it. They think that pornography is like Playboy from the 1970s or 80s. It's not. Most pornography today is online. It's not in magazine form. Most prostitution today is online. It's not on the street. Today, online prostitution, and that's pictures, right? Online prostitution is pictures of prostitution. Whether it's a streaming video or a still photograph, it's a picture. Pornography is prostitution with a camera in the room. That's the only difference. You just have a camera in the room.
Yeah.
And today, pornography is how women are trafficked. That's how they're sold. It's a seamless integration of several different arms of the sex industry. If you're looking at pornography online and masturbating, that's what pornography is for. It's for masturbation. It teaches men how to be sex buyers. It connects a deeply impersonal kind of sexuality. It teaches men an impersonal sexuality, which, by the way, we now know is connected with sexual aggression. So it teaches men to be Johns. It's beyond what we can even talk about online, because it's so violent, so degrading, and so humiliating. But I would urge anybody who wants to be an effective activist against trafficking to go online and see what's there in the way of pornography, advertising, sex trafficking.
And you mentioned, Norma mentioned Gail Dine's book,
Yes.
Pornland. Gail Dines will be with us next week at the forum, and we've been preparing. It's just incredible, the information that she brings to this. And what you said, Melissa, is so, I've never thought of it until last week when I heard this, that pornography is filmed prostitution. That it is prostitution just with a camera in the room, as you just said. It is prostitution. So if you're engaging in pornography, you are buying sex. Whether you pay with your credit card or not, the advertising on that website is paying for that. So it's a very different concept that people are not used to. I think it's extremely important, especially what I've learned about the harm. Gail mentioned that so-called actors in pornography, the people being filmed having sex, the prostituted people, last an average of 3 months. It's so brutal, the treatment and the so-called sex in the films is so brutal that they last for 3 months before they can't participate anymore. The harm is so severe to them.
If you look at the pay range of what people are paid for different acts in pornography, it's the same kind of pay range that happens in prostitution. Here in San Francisco, we had a rather smug pornographer advertising how much he'd pay women to come and work for him, and it was the same kind of thing. You get paid more for 3 men on you at the same time. You get paid more for anal as compared to hand masturbation. It's the same thing. One of the things, just to jump back to Norma's comments about welcoming men into our movement in the front lines, I also think that we have to emphasize what men have to lose by watching pornography. They are going to lose their autonomous sexuality. And I would like to refer people to a wonderful video by a young Israeli man named Ron Gavrieli, Gavrieli. We've got that up. If you look at the prostitutionresearch.com website under resources and videos, Ron talks about 2 reasons why he quit using pornography. First, because he came to understand what you just said, Karen, that the women in it are deeply harmed, prostituted women. But the second reason he quit is that it was ruining his relationship with the woman he was in love with. It was causing him to not be able to sustain an erection. It was causing him to think about her in a critical way because she wasn't an airbrushed model. And he came to realize at a deep level what he had to lose. And I think we have to point this out to men. They have a lot to lose by watching, and the average man is watching a couple hours of pornography a day.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. You know, another book that I would want men to read, that video, by the way, it really shows that men, the way men talk about pornography is always going to be different from the way women talk about pornography, because they are real, their sexuality is truly being corrupted. But there's another book I would add that should be read by men who intend to work against this with us, which is the book by Victor Malarick. It's the world's first and only book on the Johns, and it's called The Johns. And Victor Malarick also wrote the Natashas. He's been an early advocate against this human rights violation, and he's very clear on the harm of prostitution, and he talks about who are these Johns, what do they buy in prostitution. So I recommend that book be read as well, The Johns by Victor Malarick.
Yes, go ahead.
Can I say some happy words of encouragement towards the end here? I really think that over the last decade, as a result of many, many years of activism, we're winning. The Nordic model law has passed, as Norma said, in a number of countries. We're a little bit behind here in the U.S., and we need to know that. But in other countries, tremendous progress is being made, and the Swedish government has come out with a report that shows that street prostitution has been dropped at least in half. Some people say it's been decreased by 75%. It doesn't look like people are going indoors, as the advocacy groups say. It looks like there's a general decrease in prostitution in Sweden, and there's a lot of progress being made. Prostitution doesn't go underground because pimps can't advertise if it's totally underground. They have to advertise. Right. And if sex buyers can find prostitution, then so can police officers. Right. So if we focus on the buyer, we're going to learn all we need to know about trafficking.
So we only have a couple more minutes. I want to give you each a top, we've already captured a few of them, but if you could just say a few final words about how people can become involved. We're going to begin capturing these ideas and create a way for people out there who are interested in helping and being involved. What are your top recommendations? If you could just bullet point them for our audience here right at the end. Norma, let's start with you, and then we'll end with Melissa.
Well, first let me say what an honor it has been to be on this panel with each of you, but I want to give special mention to Melissa Farley. Melissa Farley runs the Prostitution Research and Education NGO, and she is the world's leading expert on this issue. And she has not enjoyed the support she should be. We never got to talk about the role of philanthropy. Her organization, we all use it. If we're going to be honest, if we're going to be honest, as soon as you said, what can we do? Anyone who wants to work against prostitution and sex trafficking is at one point or another going to go on her website. So here we have the first thing we can do, which is to support the work of organizations like PRE, to support the survivor leadership. This is another key thing to support. I have come into this movement. I am not a survivor. I'm a lawyer, and I have come into this movement first and foremost to learn from the survivors, to listen to what the survivors have to say, because they have been my teachers, and I continue to learn from them. And so one of my political goals is to support the leadership of survivors, and so we can do that. And then, of course, I would say that men must join this movement from an abolitionist perspective. They must be accountable to the abolitionist leaders, and this is how we build a principled movement. And we must reach these philanthropists. I want the philanthropists who are funding anti-trafficking to fund the abolitionists, because if you look at history, and I have my undergraduate degree is in African American Studies, and it is always those who do the work in the movement that refuse to compromise, who continue to come from a principled position. Those are the ones that actually advance the goals of the social justice movement. And so support abolition.
Well, that's a great opportunity, and Melissa, you'll share with us your information, which we'll post on how anyone can donate to prostitution research and support you in a variety of ways. You'll let us know how to do that. That's a great call. And Melissa, why don't you take us out with your final thoughts?
Just a couple things. I would love to see people involved in the anti-trafficking movement start to make the connections between sexism and racism and poverty. And that means there is a huge number of things that people can do. As I said, they can support initiatives in their hometown to provide low-income people with housing so that they and their kids can stay out of prostitution. They can work against racism that prevents people from getting good educations and good jobs. Children, we're talking about. They can support runaway shelters for runaway youth. It's pathetic how few of those we have in the United States. We say we're against child abuse, but when a child runs away from an abusive home, they more often than not get their housing from a pimp. We need to provide them with support and housing. We need to provide housing and support services for adult women who are getting out of prostitution. I'm afraid to tell you that I can count on two hands the number of agencies who offer housing and support in the United States. Organizations like Breaking Free in Minneapolis, Refuge House in Tallahassee, Florida. And finally, this might sound odd, I would beg new people to our movement to not start a new NGO and try and raise money for that. Instead, find all of the organizations that are meeting the goals that former President Carter has laid out for us in this summit, the goals of ending sexual exploitation. There are many, many nonprofits out there cash-strapped, and they need your support. So look around and find one that you can support.
Oh, I need to add one more thing.
Well, that's wonderful, and we've come to the end of our... Oh, yes, go ahead, Norma.
One promising development is, of course, that transgendered human beings are very vulnerable to sex trafficking and prostitution, and it has been very encouraging to see that our culture is beginning to move away from bigotry against these most vulnerable members of our community. So I want to encourage that we continue to support ending all forms of bigotry against this community as well, because they remain at the top of the list of vulnerable human beings, the LGBTQ community. And we want to add our voices to ending any form of bigoted attitudes towards this community.
Absolutely. Well, that's a good way to end. And I want to thank Norma Ramos and Melissa Farley, and we were expecting Kathy Berry, whom you mentioned earlier, to join us, but she wasn't able to, but we'll get to hear her next week at the summit, which is an amazing opportunity for all of us. And I would just like to tell our audience that we'll have another roundtable on this topic 2 weeks from today, right here on the Forum on Women, Religion, Violence, and Power. To see the program for that, we'll be joined by Gunilla Ekberg, whom you mentioned earlier, and Gail Dines and Kathleen Berry on that one. And they will give us, they will have a chance to wrap up the ideas from the summit and tell us what we should all do next. So this is, I'm very excited about this series on this topic, and you've made it possible for us, Dr. Farley and Norma Ramos. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Karen. Thanks.